For this discussion, we're going to be going over sovereignty. Now, this is less of a historical discussion and more of an actual policy discussion because there's really no historical precedent on sovereignty, as sovereignty is more of an actual idea that actually states that each country has its own rights to run the way it actually wants to without interference from other nations, and each country can actually have its own right to not be invaded by any other country, being through immigration, through any other means. Now, this is going to anger people from both the right and the left because it's going to touch on issues of both intervention and is going to touch on issues of the ideas of open borders. It's going to essentially shut the ideas of both of these down. From the ideas of angering the people on the people on the right believe that there needs to be, or at least when it comes to neoconservatives, they believe that there needs to be this global police force on board at all times. These are people like John Bolton, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, other ones like this, Bill Kristol, and these people like this believe that there need to be a global police force out there that's out there defending everything at all times and is basically intervening at all times around the globe, which is not exactly representing the sovereignty of not only the U.S., but also those other nations to be able to run as they wish. And this is something that's really flies in the face of the theory of sovereignty. When you have sovereignty, the nation should be able to run as they see fit, and they shouldn't be intervened upon. And basically, the only way that intervention should happen is through the actual passage of ideas. And if the actual ideas change the way a nation runs naturally, then that is going to happen. But if it doesn't, then you just need to leave it alone and mind your own business. Because you need to focus on what your own nation is doing for itself and not trying to create this whole utopian vision that you have in your head. And that goes into foreign policy, which we'll probably discuss in depth of the actual types of systems of beliefs for foreign policy in depth, more than I have before, or more than I have up to date. And we'll probably get into that probably a little bit later down the road. But as of right now, with it, it basically goes under the liberal foreign policy idea of the liberal perspective that basically believes that you can create this utopian vision through intervention. And it's held by both sides of the neoconservatives and a lot of the progressives, that they believe that you can create this utopian vision where everybody shares the same type of governing idea, and that essentially sovereignty doesn't matter anymore because essentially it's all universal. This is where you find them trying to create ideas of like the European Union and all these other multilateral trade agreements. This is where this really comes from, is this idea of this what they're calling now a global order, or what they used to call a new order, or new world order in the past, by Dr. Henry Kissinger and George Herbert Walker Bush used to call it this. And it's not some type of conspiracy theory because these are their words that they're using. And some people are doing through intervention through this. Now, it's also, on the other end, you have some of the more new people that are trying to do it through political means, which is having the idea saying that borders are immoral, and that And we're not only seeing this through people who are on the left, but we're even seeing this disturbing fact by some of these new libertarian people that came over from leaving the Democratic Party. These kind of LP 2.0ers, they like to call them, because they don't really believe in liberty per se or any of the ideas of the Constitution. They just kind of believe in more of a libertine type of attitude, and they love that idea, but they don't like anything else of the libertarian ideas. And so they just propose these ideas of these open border policies to the Libertarian Party, with still, and then proposing even ideas of high regulation, like enforcing ideas of making people comply just because you think it's social justice. Meanwhile, basically, it's totally against individual rights, regardless if you don't like what the person's doing. You cannot enforce morals, and that's the whole point. And then back to this is basically, when you have this and you do this, this is essentially against the idea of sovereignty to begin with. And when you essentially abolish sovereignty and you do not have any nation running itself, essentially you're going to create one giant superstate. And when we look at these superstates, the only evidence we have of a superstate is the Soviet Union, and that's not good. And essentially, if we look at what any ideas of what they want for superstates again, is essentially pretty much technologically advanced copies of the same exact thing. This is what's basically been proposed out of the UN with their ideas of smart cities, of basically packing a bunch of people within cities and leaving essentially everything else to the wealthiest people to own the land, essentially forcing people off land that they own and telling them you have to be packed within these cities, work at the factories that they say, but packaging it all up like it's something popular to get a lot of these kids to buy into it. And they're basically packaging it up in these video presentations to make it seem like it's something cool, as if it's something that they're going to be doing something that's new and cutting edge and something of this sort. Meanwhile, it's just copying exactly what the Soviet Union was doing from its existence to its failure. And we see what happened with them. They end up falling, and the same systems were basically end up becoming these abandoned little quote unquote smart cities that we call now, but were essentially these cramped little micro communities. They were basically set for basic production of these components that they needed for the actual state. And basically that's essentially what they wanted to have happen. And this is really what's being said. And that's when you get what you get when you abandon sovereignty. So when we're talking about sovereignty, it's not something that's negative. It's something that's positive, because it's basically the first line of defense for individual liberty. It's not something they're basically keeping people out. It's basically each individual country having the right to choose how they want to be run. And it keeps a basic line of defense against everything. The idea of having one government is essentially, it's not going to be one government being run in a positive method, as they try to display in movies out there. It's going to be one government being run essentially as the common denominator of everything that is negative. And this is something that needs to be understood. You're not going to get the best you're not going to get the best of all of the countries put together. You're going to get the worst case scenario of the worst of the countries. You're not going to. This is just how things go when it comes to the ideas. You're not going. You never get the best when you end up trying to eliminate all of these things, because the fact is that what they're going to do is you need to concede to any type of extremism when it comes to these oppressive regimes, such as China, that restricts people's access to information, that will require everyone to have access of information restricted. When it comes down to the idea of certain countries running labor camps, that's going to such as North Korea does. That's going to be repeated with the United States and everybody else of these freer countries that essentially don't do this. When it comes down to imprisoning for such things as like drugs, there's going to be places that are going to be doing it to extreme levels, like the United States will currently, and they're going to be and everybody's going to be doing that. So everything's going to basically be the worst of the whole world, and it's going to be basically where you have the worst common denominator, because nobody wants to be offended. Then when you're also going to essentially create a thing where laws are going to be set to essentially make it to where you cannot offend anyone. We're already seeing this with these so-called standards of hate crimes and hate speech, and while the United States does not have the standard of hate speech as with the Supreme Court, which is a very big positive, when it comes to the international system, we're seeing countries in Europe that have this, and they're prosecuting people for words they don't want to hear. And you're seeing countries you're seeing these countries that are theocracies that are punishing people for saying things they shouldn't be saying, and this is what you end up causing. So this is what you will get when you create a borderless society. And that's the whole problem. I mean, we can this is why when we look at the idea of a society without borders, this is what ends up occurring. And this is why sovereignty was actually created as an idea to begin with. It's not a negative thing. It's actually a very positive thing. It's even those who wanted to secure the most liberty knew this from the very beginning. It doesn't mean that you can't move freely. We can create systems in which people can move freely. We just need to understand that countries need to have the right to create their own laws. What needs to be understood is, if we want to allow people to move freely, we need to have it to where if you enter a country, you need to have it to where you need to assume that you get nothing from that country itself. And once we adopt this universal law for all travelers, I think that we can come to a conclusion that we can have a lot of this free travel from nation to nation, a lot closer to what they have in Europe. But what's going to happen is it's going to be a little bit different, as people are not going to assume that they're going to get free things when they enter a country. You don't get free health care, you don't get free schooling, you don't get free money for different things of food. You don't get free housing. You don't get anything free. What happens when you come in the country, you have to pay for everything. And basically what would be used is just a basic background check, and if you pass that, you could essentially go from country to country without a problem, assuming that you can afford the plane flights or whatever type of travel you're going to use. And then basically just pass through the correct ports and just enter correctly, and then you're going to go from place to place. And you could essentially do this easily under sovereignty, and it would allow you to do so. But when we talk about these, the idea of a superstate is never good. That's why even with the idea of the U.S., is really essentially not even being run correctly, as it's meant to be. As it's meant to be a body of essentially 50 individual states that are meant to essentially work together to essentially come with some type of common law to deal with one another as they're interconnected. Now, when it comes down to it, is we can easily fix that by essentially decentralizing a lot of the power of the federal government. And this is what needs to happen. We need to understand that that this is not like an average state in another part of the world. That these individual states need to have 100% sovereignty over the federal government, and when they make a decision, it needs to stand, and it should not be challenged by the federal government. Now because they're interconnected, there can be certain issues of ambiguity with immigration, but beyond that, there should be no issues currently. Now, as I said, with the idea of immigration, we can actually solve that issue very simply by limiting all of this idea of public aid from nation to nation. And we would solve the issue within seconds, and we wouldn't have people moving from nation to nation to basically get free items as freebies, because it's in the nature of people basically to try to get as many things as they can for the least amount of money spent, and and to be in the best situation they possibly can. That's just the nature of people. They're always looking for the best deal possible. This is just basic economics. So when we start saying we're going to give you free things, when a country does that, what's going to happen is going to cause a massive migration from nations that aren't really offering any of that, and they're essentially going to have a massive migration from countries that don't have the opportunities to that other new country, especially for people that are less likely to naturally earn as much in the new country based on income. I mean, we're seeing with like situations like Mexican immigrants that are coming into the U.S. and yet that are taking advantage of these things. Yet when we actually look at where they place, they're placing fifth from the bottom. We see Somali immigrants coming in on these so-called refugee visas, and yet they place dead last in actual earnings. This shows that they're not benefiting the country whatsoever. But yet we're biased in this country against people like from the Philippines coming into the country, which really makes zero sense. We're even biased against people from like Taiwan coming to the country, which makes zero sense as well. And these people rank fourth and third for income, respectively. And this should be basically understood that there needs to be an actual level of common sense applied to when people come in. And this is why sovereignty is a big issue. Sovereignty needs to come into play with the application of ending public aid. Now, you end public aid globally, which is going to anger a lot of people because they're going to say public aid helps people and all this other garbage, but which it doesn't. It only keeps people dependent, as we see in these countries that offer the most public aid, because we see a lot of European countries have been essentially pushing a lot of public aid, yet when they come to the United States, they're always in the middle of the pack. We see a lot of these socialist nations that come to the United States, and they're usually near the bottom for offering for earning income, and yet they're some of the highest in public aid spending. I mean, you have a lot of these socialist nations that are coming in, and yet they're near the bottom of the earners. Burma, for instance, is a socialist nation, and yet they're one of the top. They're one of the bottom 5 in earning. If you look at the Philippines is one of the easiest to actually run a business. They don't have much for public aid. They offer bare minimum for services. When you get medical treatment, you have to provide your own food, but they have very cheap cost, high quality medical treatment, and this is what you end up getting. You end up getting these people that come to the United States, and they're high income earners because they're willing to basically work their butts off, and that's what you end up getting. So when you get sovereignty without public aid, we can have this idea of people moving from state to state. You don't need to have this idea of open borders. Open borders is just a grand idea from people who basically want to essentially cheapen the idea of the way governing works. It's basically to essentially take away people's ability to raise the level of their country to a higher level of the way people have their rights. So if you have open borders, all it does is it just lowers it down. Basically, it takes all of the top nations and lowers them all the way down to the bottom. Middle level nations get lowered to the bottom, and the bottom stay at the bottom. This is all you end up getting in the end, and this is something that people need to understand. And it's something that I think a lot of people don't understand, and this is something that's very sad. And I think that people need to understand this fact first before actually being negative on the concept of sovereignty. And when we view sovereignty, it's actually very closely related to nationalism, but nationalism is a little bit different because it kind of works in the idea of patriotism as well. More of actually positive, I would say more of actually positive patriotism. There are some people within nationalism that will also bring in the concepts of protectionism, but not always. But nationalism itself with it has this stigmatism that people tend to link negatively because you have National Socialism, and that people end up thinking that's exactly what nationalism is. It's not necessarily. That was just essentially the outcome of a socialist system that was out in Germany, and it just gotten renamed democratic socialism in modern years to basically get rid of that nationalism title, so that people can basically essentially claim that Hitler was a right-winger when he was really a left-wing socialist. And so basically they can kind of it was just another type of switch on history, so that they can teach people essentially completely erroneous facts, and so that they can make socialism look popular again. And this is why we have this new little boost of socialists out there that really have no idea what they're talking about. I hate to tell people this, but that's frankly the truth. They have no idea what they're talking about. They have no idea what socialism is. You have just a mix of stupid old hippies and basically these young people who have no idea what socialism is. If they actually look at what socialism and communism did, you'll actually look at some of the most murderous dictators in the history of the world. This is all what socialism and communism is. If you look at the ones who had the least amount of murders under their regime, these are basically would be the most benevolent. This is like the Castro brothers would be like the most benevolent of all of socialism, and that's hardly what I'd call a benevolent leader. I mean, even under our worst leaders like uh, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, who else? Woodrow Wilson, um, Theodore Roosevelt, and naming a few other ones like that. Even when you start naming ones like that, you're going to find out that basically is that they're pretty much not anywhere close to as bad as that. The actual domestic death tolls are nowhere close from that. I mean, they're horrible when it comes to actually liberty with it, but the liberty that these people in these socialist countries have is near the bottom. I mean, you can look at liberty rankings for countries out there from different from different groups, from like Mercatus to Cato, and you'll find the same rating that shows that they're near the bottom, that all of them are near the bottom, and that historically, when you start totaling up all of these numbers of people that were killed, you'll find that you're you're well over 100 million people. And there's rumors that we could even be, that's just for the 20th century, and there's rumors we could it could even be over 1 billion for that thing if you total all these socialist dictators, because the actual numbers aren't quite fully known, and that because there were quite a few of these people, everyone from Mao to Hussein to Castro brothers to even most recently with Chavez and Maduro. And you have all of these people that basically say, hey, just shoot them. You have some of the horrible ones like the Castro brothers executioner Che Guevara, who had no trouble shooting women and children first, and had no trouble shooting them in the back of the head. So it was really this is why we don't want to essentially go to this global system to where we have completely open borders, and we go to essentially the lowest common denominator of all systems. That's why we want to essentially go to sovereignty. So eventually we have something where each country can essentially say, hey, we want to be like that country in this area, and then every country can essentially look up to aspire to be like a certain country in a certain area, and eventually every country can get to that point by trying to change the way they are in each certain area, and then you can get to an ideal point. That's the way how these ideal points get, because there's going to be certain points that maybe Hong Kong's better in a certain area of business, Singapore's area in a certain better in another area of business, maybe the U.S. is better in a certain area socially, or maybe the Switzerland's in better in other areas socially and business wise, and it boils down to adding all these things up, and that's where it comes from, and that's what we need to view, and this is why sovereignty is actually a positive thing. It's just a matter of how it becomes applied. I mean, we don't have to have restrictive immigration laws if we get rid of the public aid globally. We could just say no public aid, no foreign aid, and anybody can go anywhere as long as they pass a criminal background check, and we get a free movement for anyone as long as they can afford the travel expenses, and you're on your own. It's really just that simple. And then every country can look to improve on its own. Then countries like China can essentially say, hey, if we want to bring more people in, we're going to have to essentially eliminate our surveillance system, because our surveillance system and our rating of people on this social system, because frankly it's not working, and people don't want to come here, or we're going to have to eliminate our high amount of air pollution because people don't want to breathe in smog when they come to our cities. And the US is going to say, hey, if people want to come here, we're going to have to essentially end our war on drugs. And this is the way it's going to have to come across all nations. And eventually you're going to have nations that are going to be trying to reduce costs, trying to reduce regulations, trying to make things socially better for everyone. And everyone's going to be competing for everyone's business. And this is how you get a better world. You don't get it by, number one, you don't get it by force. And number two, you never get it by open borders, because you're just going to frankly make things to be the common denominator of everything worse. And you don't want essentially to be the bottom of the barrel. That's the way things become horrible. And especially if you become the bottom of the barrel, then anybody that's essentially has this crazy idea in their head to become a dictator, if there's open borders, you could have some crazy person who wants to be a dictator of an area, and he can take over the area very, very easily, even if it's just some open area, and that area can spread very, very fast. And this is why we don't do that, because it doesn't take that long for it to spread. It'll become like a virus like Ebola is, and it can spread very, very fast. And this is why sovereignty is also an excellent idea. Now, if you like this, like it, subscribe, and click the bell. Make sure to share on all the social media, Twitter, Facebook. What else? Make sure to, and all the other social media ones. Can't think of any offhand with it, but whatever ones you guys use. And I will see you either later today or possibly tomorrow, depending on what ends up hitting my mind for any ideas for posts. Later, everyone. Bye.